Hi everyone, this week we are going to go over the second unbundling, part 1 of the second unbundling. That starts in the 1990s until pretty much the present, until right now. The usual disclaimer, those notes are inspired, partly taken, and sometimes fully taken from Professor Nikolai Schmidt's notes. I am responsible for any error, and I do not legally allow this content to be published without my consent. So beware if I see this on another platform than Canvas. Okay, so time for the second unbundling. In the first unbundling, we talked about the decrease in trade costs and in particular transportation costs due to the steam revolution. So the steam revolution allowed long distance transportation to be way cheaper than before through trains, air cargo as well, and boats. This first unbundling lasted until pretty much the 1990s. We went through 3 different acts. The first act that goes all the way to World War I, from 1820, 1815 to World War I. Then the 2 world wars rebundled consumption and production because many countries, in particular European countries, the industrialized countries, the ones who were producing most of the manufacturing goods in the world, were in the state of war, so they closed themselves again. And after World War II came another period of huge trade liberalization. We talked about many institutions such as the GATT, G-A-T-T, the World Trade Organization, succeeded the General Agreement on Tariff and Trades, the IMF, the World Bank, many organizations that are bigger than countries in order for those countries to trade with each other in a peaceful way. In the 1990s, the communication costs decreased sharply, and this is what triggered the second unbundling. ICTs, information and communication technology, lowered the cost of moving ideas. This cost went from very expensive to nearly costless in 20 years. And this allowed continuous confirmed exchange of information. Emails. The internet in the US, it's something rather old that was already available at the beginning of the 90s. I personally am from the countryside in France, so I remember my cousin having the internet in 98, which was really, really slow. And I think I got the internet in 2003 or 4, and that was not great either, but I could download my movies for free and, and start watching stuff for free online, at least. Web-based coordination software packages were created, in particular by Microsoft and Apple. So many of the software are about logistics, inventory control, quality control, and so on. That solved many coordination problems and helped with decision-making regardless of the distance. In particular, it helped a lot with time difference, different time zones. When you're from Europe and you have to deal with an office in the US, communication went way more smoothly through emails than having to do phone calls at a very narrow window of the day where both people at the end of the phone would be working. So ICT is I for information, so that's related to computing and data storage costs. C for communication, so it's mostly transmission costs and reliability. And T for, well, for technology, so new working methods, new innovations, new processes, and new workplace organization. There are 3 main laws that drive the ICT revolution. So those laws are, I believe, have been stated in more mathematical terms, but here we're going to see them in a more layman's terms. Moore's law, first, states that computing power grows exponentially. So computer chip performances double every time, and that drives the information. If you remember the price of an external hard drive or USB stick 10 years ago, you'll be amazed to see that it was like $100 to get something like 500 gigabytes or something like that, even less. What did I have in 2010? I think I had 150 gigabytes and it cost me like almost 100 euros or something. I went to Staples yesterday and I saw that for $100 you can find stuff of 1, 2, or 3 terabytes. You can find 500 gigabytes SSD, so solid state drive, external hard drives for around $100. I think that was the price. Think about computer chips. Every year you have new generations of processors which are way more performant than the previous generation. We had the i3, the i5 by Intel, the i7, and now I believe there exists some i9 and even more with I don't know how many cores you can have in that. So you can do a lot of computations. Gilder's law talks about the bandwidth. So it talks about the communication part, how fast communication goes between two different locations. The bandwidth grows 3 times faster than computing power. And computing power grows exponentially already. So you can see how the communication aspect of the ICT revolution is improving very fast. And the fact is right now, you can hear me from the other side of the world almost instantaneously. I don't even believe there is any lag right now. If you watch live streams on Twitch or on YouTube, there is almost no lag now. There's less than a second latency, even for streams that are being broadcasted from the other side of the world. I started looking at live streams on Twitch, I believe in 2013, and there was already a bit of a lag, especially when streams were super far ahead. Super far from me. The last one is Metcalfe's law. The usefulness of a network rises with the square of the number of users. Oh yeah, there must be a bunch of Pokemon fans here indeed. Pokemon who speaks French. She went to a couple of French live streams recently. But sorry, I don't want to get into that. So here the usefulness is of course measured, but there is a specific measure, like there's a specific definition of what usefulness of a network here is. But the idea is that every time you have an additional user on a network, it becomes incredibly more profitable on one hand and useful for users on the other hand to get onto that network. So thinking about network, let's talk about network effects. Network effects are equivalent to internal economies of scale. The average cost gets lower with more users. The idea is that if you operate a platform, think about YouTube, Twitch, or anything like that, having 5 users or 10 users is not that much costly. Once the platform can accommodate for a high number of people, any extra person is not going to create any problem. It's not going to incur any extra cost to the firm. Typically, if you think about how much I am getting paid per student I teach to on Zoom, having 10 students on Zoom or having 89 students like right now on Zoom, or 88, I am the 89th person, doesn't make any difference for me. When I'm teaching for 5 people, I can be teaching for 89 people as well. Zoom is still working. I don't know about 500 people. I've never reached that amount on Zoom, but the amount I'm paid per student, the cost per student, is now lower to the university because they pay me the same amount whether there are 5 people on Zoom or 89. And the willingness to pay for a network of each consumer, so users, us, increases with the density of the network. The more dense a network is, the more users there are, the more interesting the platform gets, the network gets. And so, the higher the willingness to pay or the willingness to spend time on the network is. If you think about YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, those networks are free. You can always, I believe, pay to get extra features, maybe no ads or things like that. You can pay for YouTube Premium, have access to additional movies and things like that. But in general, the platforms are free to use. And the more users there are on those platforms already, the more time you are willing to spend on these platforms. But the time that you spend on these platforms represents some sort of willingness to pay. It's not a monetary amount, but it's an opportunity cost. If I decide to spend an hour on YouTube, it's an hour I could be spending maybe working, maybe tutoring, coming back to the quiz, or maybe doing something else that potentially could pay me money. And this extra hour you spend on YouTube is going to represent ad revenue for YouTube. Note that the more users there are on those platforms, the more interesting it is for announcers as well. Firms who want to post an ad on YouTube or Facebook will be willing to pay a higher price to post their ads on channels that have many subscribers or many viewers. In fact, those platforms are called two-sided markets. That's a very brand new type of market that arose very recently, where the platform acts like a market, and it's gathering users on one hand and announcers on the other hand. And we all have an incentive, an interest in using the platform. But we users are not interacting directly with the announcers. They are not the producer. So it's a different type of market, and it has a bunch of different characteristics. And so regulation should also be done differently. So because of these reasons, the firm's profit per user, so a firm who operates a network, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, is higher for a dense network than for a less dense one. On one hand, it attracts more users. On the other hand, it's less costly per user, the more users there are, due to economies of scale. And on the other hand, especially for the platforms I mentioned, there is also the announcer part, which are willing to pay more to post their ads on the platform. Those characteristics typically lead to monopoly power by firms in specific market segments. So I mentioned YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and so on. Each of those networks have a rather, I would say, specific purpose. I know that Twitter and Facebook are competitors on the information market, but when it comes to coordinating with friends and things like that, it seems Facebook has the upper hand. When it comes to looking for information and interacting with people that you don't necessarily know, it seems that Twitter has the upper hand. I say it seems because I am on none of those platforms. Instagram is also another social network, which is picture-based and has the upper hand for a different type of communication. I am on none of these things, so don't quote me too much on that. But think about YouTube. At the beginning of YouTube, 2005, you guys might be a bit young, so I don't know if you were using YouTube back then, but I was using YouTube maybe a month after it was created. A friend of mine on MSN back then, that was the social network, that was the social media back then, told me about YouTube, and we started watching YouTube pretty early on. There were not many videos back then, and 1 million views video was already a big highlight. In this day and age, 1 million views is not a minimum, but it's a rather average number for a YouTuber. YouTube had a competitor back then. In fact, YouTube had 2 or 3 competitors back then. One of them was called Google Video. I don't know if you've known Google Video because it did not last very long. It might still be there, but Google Video was another repository for video content. I remember personally watching many skateboard videos. I'm big into skateboarding. On Google Videos, and watching some random videos of cats and things like that on YouTube. There was another network on that was competing with, but that was competing with them. Sorry, it was called Dailymotion. Dailymotion still exists. You can take a look online. It's a French platform that lost a lot of steam over time. So they did not manage to attract as many users as they needed to get a head start on the race. YouTube is the one who managed to attract all of those users early on, and the more users you have, the more interesting the network gets for non-users. And so many people started looking at YouTube, getting links from their colleagues, from their friends, you know, and then eventually now YouTube became the main platform for video content. There is still Vimeo, but Vimeo is used for different purposes. It's usually like video projects, photography projects. It's usually like very HD stuff. You don't have random videos of cats and people farting and stuff like that on Vimeo. On Dailymotion, you can find many videos that YouTube censored, that YouTube, for one reason or another, censored. So that's Dailymotion is an interesting platform. The quality is still not great though. But you can see how benefiting from a high network is going to give you a huge edge on a market, and eventually, if you manage to do a sufficiently good job, will lead you to have monopoly power. YouTube pretty much has monopoly power now. Wow, there are many Dailymotion users. I'm pretty surprised. How come? I thought only French people knew about Dailymotion. Okay. You can still find some movies on Dailymotion, like movies in 10 parts, sure, but you can find them. So the ICT revolution is much faster than earlier economic revolutions. Steam revolution took decades. It's not that in 1920s we already had old network of railroads, we had a bunch of trains, we had cargo ships and so on. This took a lot of time, installation costs, maintenance costs, and innovations were constantly pushed. The first steam train was definitely not as performant as the one they made even 5 years later. The number of global internet users and phone subscriptions skyrocketed pretty much in the middle of the 90s. Here, you can see that 94, 95 is starting to pick up, and you can see how it follows a, at least for telephone subscriptions and cellular subscriptions, mobile cellular subscriptions, you can see how the trend became exponential. This is typically an exponential curve. For those of you who are about to take pre-calc and calc classes, that shape should remind you of the exponential function. Oh, sorry, that was internet users. Fixed telephone subscription increased, but not as much as fixed telephones were already pretty widespread in the 80s and in the 70s. As an example, myself, I had a fixed telephone at home, and it's only after 2004 or 5 that my parents started having a cell phone, the old Nokias. Still the best Nokias, still the best phones in my mind, but personal taste. And same, we got the internet around 2005. So let's date the start. Here is a graph showing the transportation versus the communication costs from 1920 to 1990. Unfortunately, the graph looks like shit because of somebody put a white curve, somebody put a graph in white, so we can barely see that the satellite charges, which is actually communication costs, decreased very sharply. You can only see here pretty much that there is a sharp decrease in those costs around the 1980s. All costs decreased otherwise, so ocean freight, air freight, and so on. And those decreases are pretty sharp in the space of 70 years, including 30 years of world wars, like 2 world wars and in between a Great Recession. And you can relate this decrease in communication costs with the increase in telephone subscriptions, mobile cellular subscriptions, and internet users. So now that people can communicate all over the world at a lower cost, there is going to be a huge change in the way work works, in the way the production process is going to be organized. There's going to be a change in work and management practices, relationships among firms, with their suppliers, with their customers. Okay? Well, production now is easier to coordinate at distance. So if you are a multinational firm, you can coordinate with different offices when you plan to launch new products, for instance. Or if, let's say, a product is being created, or at least there is some research and development being done in the US, the innovation can quickly be communicated to an office in Europe or in Asia so that the product can be launched rather quickly and at the same time. Information management innovations. Easier, cheaper, faster to coordinate, separate complex activities spatially. Pretty much you can just throw a couple of emails, even if at that time on the other side of the world somebody is sleeping. When they wake up, boom, they see their email, they can coordinate, they can call, they can send texts internationally as well. So coordination is way faster. And in particular, it made offshoring feasible. In here, we need to define what offshoring is, as well as outsourcing. So, offshoring first. Offshoring consists in getting work done by a firm in a different country, typically to take advantage of cost differences. So, a firm could have 2 offices, one, let's say, in Canada, one in Japan or China, whatever, somewhere in Asia. The Canadian office could offshore its work and getting some of its work done by the Korean office or the Chinese office or the Japanese office to maybe take advantage of some cost differences that could be due to wages or different technology or other aspects of the activity of the firm. So offshore pretty much means off the shore, so getting work done outside of a territory, different country. Outsourcing consists in getting work done by somebody else, by another firm than your own firm. Of course, many firms do both offshoring and outsourcing at the same time. A firm outsources without offshoring if it hires another firm in the same territory. For instance, a close-by law firm to review contracts instead of having an in-house staff of lawyers. Think about the same for accounting. If a firm doesn't have a staff of accountants, it might just outsource the accounting part of the firm to an accounting firm, to a firm which is specialized in accounting in a specific market, industry. On the other hand, a Canadian firm offshores without outsourcing when it establishes a customer service center in India to serve its Canadian clients. This happens a lot with phone providers. I can think about the French case, for instance. In France, we have four main phone providers. And if you call them regarding your subscription, your plan, or anything else, typically somebody with a Moroccan accent or an Algerian accent speaking French will answer. That's because those firms have their customer service center based in North African countries, where French is still one of the, maybe not the national language, but still one of the predominant languages. But those firms can take advantage of lower wages in North African countries as opposed to French wages, which are pretty high, to do the exact same job. So that would be offshoring. Finally, a firm like Apple offshores and outsources when it hires another firm, Foxconn, a Taiwanese firm, to assemble its products in China. It is not outsourcing if the firm that you have abroad belongs to you. So those phone providers might open a center in Morocco or Algeria and say it's still the same firm, but their employees are taking care of the customer service. Yes, it is the same phone provider that owns it, yes. It would be outsourcing if they were hiring a some sort of a company, a company where employees are just asked to perform a certain task on the phone all the time. But I don't know if there exists such a company actually, which is just specialized in, our employees are in their box all day on the phone, and if the contract is from a phone provider, they're going to get trained to answer phone provider related questions. I believe that especially in those sectors, firms like to have their own customer service because they can train their own employees to answer very specific questions. I think it would be too expensive to hire to get the work done by another firm because you need to train those other employees. Offshoring and outsourcing have benefits and risks. The benefits of offshoring are usually lower costs. You get work done somewhere else because it's cheaper. You can get work done as well faster through a global talent pool. You can benefit from a more global pool of skills than just the one in your territory. One of the risks, and it's not really a risk, but it's a con, it's been criticized for transferring jobs to other countries. Typically, it's a very typical extreme right-wing argument. In France, especially when it comes to those phone providers, the extreme right wing would say those people in Morocco and Algeria are stealing our jobs. Those jobs should be taken by French people. That's usually the argument for this is why you guys are losing their job. Factories are closing in France because it's cheaper to produce things abroad. And this is where nationalists typically come in. Stupid argument or not, that's the argument they use to rally all of those people who are left out, who are losing their job, who are in their 40s or 50s, who know nothing else, who already have a house and a family, who cannot move to another part of the country easily, and have a very specific set of skills that they cannot use anymore in an area close to where they live. Other caveats are the language, of course, communication problems, and sometimes geopolitical risks, because it could be cheaper to produce in another country, but there might be some diplomatic issues or some conflicts that might make offshoring difficult. What about outsourcing? The benefits is to take advantage of specialized skills. If you decide to hire a lawyer from a law firm, well, you're hiring someone from a firm which is maybe specialized in contracts related to your own industry. There could be cost efficiencies because another firm which is more specialized than you is doing the work for you. So it might be cheaper to hire a firm which is already well organized, who is already well trained, its employees are well trained, instead of you maybe opening an office to hire some accountants and train them in a specific way. Training can be very expensive, especially if maybe you're not good at training. Some firms hire people to train their own employees. You've also seen those, I'm sure you've heard of those big firms who hire other people from the outside to give seminars about motivation, about drive, about things like that. That's part of a training program. My office mate worked in a bank in Brazil, and he told me that at some point his firm, so a bank, hired Bob Burnquist. I don't know if you know who Bob Burnquist is. He is one of the greatest skateboarders of all time. Why did the bank hire a skateboarder? They hire him to give a seminar about motivation, goals, taking risks, and so on. This was part of a broader training program. Kickflips, yeah, Bob Burnquist does a bit more than kickflips, but yeah. The risks of outsourcing are misaligned interest among firms. After all, you're dealing with another firm that has different incentives. There is an increased reliance on third parties. So if this other party is going down or for some reason is not able to fulfill the contract, you might run into some issues. You might not be able to meet some deadlines. There could be a lack of in-house knowledge of important business operations. There could be a detail or two that you need the lawyer to know, but the lawyer still, since the lawyer works for a law firm, the lawyer might not be aware of those details and might learn them on the job. But the lawyer might learn them a bit late. My gym's owner, for instance, right now, is trying to produce some apparel. He's trying to put some his logo on some t-shirts, trying to sell some gis and some fighting equipment. He's been talking about this for a year now, but he had some issues with a supplier because of, I think, communication costs and also delays in the production of prototypes. That's one of the issues with outsourcing. Of course, the owner of the gym is not going to produce his own gis. He doesn't know how to sew. I mean, there's a whole process behind it. And he tried at some point to both offshore and outsource. So he tried to produce, to get the fighting equipment produced from a firm in Pakistan, which is where many fighting equipment is being done. If you look at fighting gloves, for instance, many of them are produced in Pakistan. Many gis for judo, jiu-jitsu, and so on are being made in Pakistan. So he contacted a supplier there, made some plans about how he wants his geese to look like and so on. He got a prototype or two that were working fine. There was some back and forth, but eventually the communication got cut off. Could be due to COVID as well. He had many problems and eventually just said, yeah, no, let's not deal with you anymore. He found someone in Vancouver who happens to be in a relationship with a firm in Pakistan. But this way he can deal with this person in Vancouver directly rather than having to deal with somebody so far ahead, so far away, and dealing with things like, you know, with the language barrier and so on. So the second unbundling, because of the decrease in communication costs, allowed offshoring to be feasible and profitable, and this led to a fractionalisation of the production process. The top picture here shows a Ford plant in Detroit, I believe in 1914 or 1913. It's a huge, huge area, and everything is produced on site. The wheels, the shell, the engine, and so on. The bottom picture now shows shows the production of a car after the second unbundling. You can see that each part is produced by a different firm located in a different area. I didn't look at it too much, but I see that there is one thing here, instrument panel made in France. Here, the sway bar is made in France. What else is made in France? Here, the taillights. But interestingly, the taillights are made in France, but the headlights are made in the US and Canada. So even lights, which seems to be pretty much the same thing, front light, rear light, same, no? Well, no. It seems that one firm can get it cheaper when it comes to taillights, and another firm can get it cheaper when it comes to the front headlights. Glass here is also made in France, it seems. You can check that Germany has a lot of is producing a lot of parts in this car. Germany, anyway, is the leader in when it comes to car parts. Sorry, I'm on the way. Well, I'll let you check this later. So with the first unbundling, all the work was done at the same location and by the same firm. So production was done in-house, from the design process, the shape of the car, how's the car is going to look like, until the car is ready. Come pick it up, or we're gonna take it to the retail store, to the distribution phase. Yeah. With the second unbundling, the production process is what's unbundled. The first unbundling was about the separation between consumption and production. You make it here, but you sell it there. It's consumed there. The second unbundling is just about the production process. This made here, this made there, this made there, this made there, and this assembled, all of that assembled somewhere else. And since the second unbundling follows the first, where the final good, the final product is assembled, is not going to be the same location as where it's going to be purchased or consumed, because we still have low transportation costs. So wherever it's assembled is not where it's going to be sold necessarily. Let's look at iPhones. There are many websites on websites on the internet that talk about the production process of an iPhone, talks about the different components, where they are done, and so on. In 2011, 70 million iPhones were sold. None of them were made in the US. However, it says design in the US, I believe, on the box. Never had an iPhone. I'm not a big Apple guy, so don't quote me on this. but I'm pretty sure that somewhere it says something something in the US. Cheap labor is the main reason why iPhone is assembled in China by Foxconn. So Foxconn is a Taiwanese firm that is in charge of coordinating the assembling of all the different parts that are being produced in different places. Oh yeah, even in California, right? They are being even more precise about that now. True. Yes, Android for the win. Nokia for the win. Not even Android. Old phones. Fast labor is another reason. Foxconn being specialized in operations that have to coordinate different types of workers. It takes them 15 days to hire 8,700 engineers against 9 months in the US. So things can get done for cheaper and faster. So let's see what comes from the US when making an iPhone. So which iPhone are we talking about here? I don't know. I don't care too much. It's an iPhone. They all look the same to me. So the design and development, for sure, well, you can guess it's made in California. Chips, iOS, radio frequency are made in the US. The radio frequency seems to be made by TriQuint in Oregon. And I believe the firm has moved to, what did I see? Nebraska, I think, since then. I forgot, or maybe North Dakota or something. I checked on a different website, and it seems that TriQuint was at some place at some point and moved. Controller chips made by PMC Sierra in California. The glass by Corning Inc. in Kentucky. The marketing in New York. New York is huge in marketing, has a lot of marketing firms. I will also go over, I think, Uniqlo, which marketing sector and design sector, I believe, is being operated in New York. What comes from outside the US? Rare earth material comes from Mongolia, China. So there is a lot of different minerals that Apple needs to make its iPhones, including zinc, cobalt, maybe a bit of gold. I don't think gold goes into an iPhone, but there are many other minerals. LCD panel is actually produced by LG. So LG, who also makes phones, makes the LCD panels of iPhones. Isn't that crazy? LG and Apple are competitors, but when it comes to making the components, they are actually not at the same level in the production process. Yeah, LG has its own phones, but it also produces some parts for Apple. Batteries as well. We all know that batteries from Samsung phones and from iPhones don't last very long. Well, it turns out they are pretty much the same. Samsung, a direct competitor to iPhones, at least on the hardware side, not on the software side, produces iPhone's batteries. It seems that it also produces some screen for iPhones. True. I don't know for which iPhone, because I guess from one iPhone to the other, sometimes the suppliers might change. But yeah, I believe Samsung produces at least two things for iPhones. Flash memory is produced by a Taiwanese firm. The gyroscope, which is I believe what's inside the location, the compass pretty much, you know, when you locate yourself and you turn around, is produced by a French firm, Italian firm, and Switzerland firm. And if you want more information about this, I found this website this morning, which is pretty cool. Let's see if I can show it to you. How could I achieve that? No, I don't think I will be able to show that to you now because of what I'm using. Slides, camera. Okay, well, I advise you to take a look at this, and it shows you each part and also the cost of an iPhone. And it shows that the cost of an iPhone, by taking all the parts, is equal to $178. iPhone 4. 16 gigabyte GSM version, so it's a pretty old iPhone. iPhone 4 was like 2000 what? 13, 14, something like that. Yeah. So it costs $178, but back then they were already sold for $500-600, something like that. So you can see that it's a pretty high value added product. So crossing borders drives knowledge offshoring. If a firm wants to offshore its production, it needs to communicate to the plant or to the firm offshore how things are going to be produced. So G7 firms, the ones who were producing all the manufacturing goods, almost all of them until 1990, need to transfer their know-how along with jobs. So now the high-tech nations, the ones who have the production process, the know-how, are going to turn to low-wage nations because they can pretty much teach those workers how to produce the goods the exact same way G7 workers are already doing it. So that would represent a huge decrease in production costs. Know-how moves across national borders within the global value chain. And I'm going to define what a global value chain is. First of all, let's talk about the value chain. This is the full range of activities that firms and workers do to bring a product or service from its conception to its end use and beyond. So it goes from the very beginning, the idea, the design, then onto the production, and in between getting all the necessary materials to produce the goods. Then the marketing, that's going to be related to how do we want to sell it. Then the distribution, which is related to who do we want to sell it, pretty much. And support to the final customer. You know, typically on the website there is the contact us, help, things like that, and customer service. The supply chain is a narrower range of activities. In particular, it emphasizes the manufacturing and distribution related steps. So if you're a consultant in, let's say, the supply chain, you will be in charge of looking at how the good is being produced. So looking at the production costs, suppliers, who supplies the necessary materials. Can we make it cheaper by the same firm? Do we ask another firm? What kind of employees do we need? And so on. And the distribution part. Who do we want to sell our product? And how do we deal with the whole distribution aspect of it? The global value chain is the same thing as the value chain, but beyond national borders. So it is a worldwide network of units involved in, again, design, production, marketing, distribution, all of those steps involved in the creation, from the creation of the good until its sale, and even beyond with customer service. These units, so all the different steps, may be operated by the same firm or by independent firm. So, because of the second unbundling, we went from looking at the supply chain or the value chain, which was where every activity was pretty much done in-house by the same firm, except maybe a couple of things like lawyers and accountants and a couple of extra services. we went from this to a global value chain where activities are being done in different parts of the world and also by different firms. Since we are talking about getting things done abroad, we need to talk about foreign direct investments, FDI. They refer to investments made to acquire a lasting interest in enterprises operating outside of the investor's own country. The purpose is to get an effective voice in the management of the enterprise. So if a firm wants to offshore, it will have to make an investment, and it will be a foreign direct investment. We distinguish 4 types of FDIs. A greenfield FDI is where a parent company builds its operations in a foreign country from scratch. So, if you think about a Canadian company opening a factory or an office in another country, that would be called a greenfield FDI. Starting from scratch, buying the building, renting the building, getting some employees there, and starting the activity, whatever they want to start there. If you want to remember, if you want a good mnemonic device, you could think of greenfield as I am green, I am new. So greenfield could be like from scratch, new investment. We also have brownfield, which is a case where a company purchases or leases existing production facilities to launch a new production activity. So a Canadian firm could purchase the activity of another firm which already exists. That would be a brownfield FDI. And then we distinguish horizontal FDIs and vertical FDIs. And these horizontal and vertical aspects are related to the production process. So we talk about a horizontal FDI when the investment is in the same business as the investor operates domestically. So horizontal means it's at the same stage of the production process. If Samsung, who makes phones, is investing into a French firm who makes phones, there is one, I think it's called Waco, I forgot. My mom has a phone from there. That would be a horizontal FDI because it's an investment from one phone producer to another in another phone producer. A vertical FDI is going to correspond to 2 different stages of the production process. So in this case, the investment is made in a foreign business that plays the role of a supplier or a distributor with respect to the domestic main activity. Typically, you are Samsung and you want to get things produced by another firm in another country, like different parts of the process. That would be a vertical FDI. If you are Adidas and you're making shoes, you might get the sole done in another country. That would represent a vertical FDI. You're getting some material or some steps of the production process done by another firm abroad. So, what's new with this whole wave of foreign direct investments, global value chains, and offshoring, outsourcing? Well, ICTs enables G7 firms to precisely control what goes on inside developing nation factories. Because they can communicate easily, they can control the whole production process, although most of the steps are happening on the other side of the world. Global value chains are pipes for new knowledge flows. G7 firms are going to communicate their production process to all of those other firms. Since know-how is complex and lumpy, after all, it's a very precise production process, especially since the invention of assembly lines and things like that, there is a bunch of engineers specialized in designing the most efficient production process. Putting the machine there, having the employees there, then the product goes from here to here, there is a minimum distance between there, and so on. So the know-how is very precise, very complex, and also lumpy. It comes in chunks. So new knowledge flows happen mostly within global value chains. A firm is going to communicate the exact production process to another firm producing something they need. So the ICT revolution leads to a global value chain revolution, mostly for large G7 firms who are having production partners all over the world. And because of that, there's going to be a massive north to south, or G7 to rest of the world, knowledge flows, which are going to transform globalization impact as opposed to the impact of globalization due to the first unbundling. ICTs literally liberated G7 firms' know-how from G7 labor. The same tasks can be done exactly the same way by non-G7 workers, so cheaper workers, cheaper labor force. So the nature of things crossing borders changed. Because of the first unbundling, we had just goods trading crossing borders, mainly due to a decrease in transportation costs. Now it's knowledge. And that changed the nature of globalization and the impact of globalization on the economic landscape as a whole, where growth is happening, where growth is coming from, in which country. Rich nation economies, which are the ones the know-how is coming from, but also countries the know-how goes to. So that would be mostly poor nations because of cheaper labor force. There's going to be a different impact on the ones who got the know-how. So the ones who got to produce for those G7 firms, and the ones who did not get to. Not every poor nation got to get contracts from those G7 firms. And now, the relevant border of knowledge no longer matches nations' borders. It's not that this nation is good at making this, like good at knowing this, and this nation is good at knowing that. Everybody in the world now knows how to make an iPhone, technically. Apple just has to show the protocol to whichever firm they want to get work done. So this transformed manufacturing worldwide. Remember, because of the first unbundling and before the second unbundling, manufacturing stayed in G7 countries. They had the innovations and they had the knowledge, and they were keeping this knowledge. It was just cheaper to send goods abroad. So in particular, if you look at 1990, which is usually the threshold we use for the beginning of the second unbundling, you can see a decrease in the world manufacturing shares for G7 countries from 65 to 47 in 20 years. Although this trend was already there a bit before the 90s, some firms in the 70s were already getting a lot of manufacturing done by other firms. I mentioned this, but my dad used to own a factory back home that was making shoes, and among other things, he was making insoles for Adidas, Puma, and bigger boots, Doc Martens. Maybe you've heard of this brand. You know, the big black shoes. And he was in his 20s back then, so that was in 75, 76, 77. He eventually had to close the factory, and he had 70 employees working on making those shoes all day, every day. He had to close the factory eventually because Adidas starting contracting in Korea, in Taiwan, and so on, in Hong Kong. Those countries who were raising back then, who rose through manufacturing, and then eventually invested in high technologies, and they are the developed countries that we know today. So this decrease in world manufacturing shares did not start in 1990, but it increased in 1990. This trend got sharper after 1990 due to communication costs. Many manufacturing goods that were relatively easy to make, like shoes, were already being made by poorer countries before 1990. But after 1990, more complicated items, more complicated goods started being produced, or at least their parts starting being produced by non-G7 countries. And you can see there's an increase for China in particular. China was a very responsive country. They pretty much said, yeah, we have cheap labor. Come, give us your stuff, give us contracts. We're gonna produce for you. Of course, it came with very poor labor conditions, with child labor and many things that we know about Chinese working conditions, which might be better now. I'm not sure. I just know that, what was it, 5-6 years ago? Or no, I was in high school. 10 years ago. Even more than 10 years ago. I was already seeing that some employees were sleeping at the office, were already sleeping at the firm. They were pretty much sleeping 6 hours a night, or maybe less sometimes, waking up, going to their desk, to their box, doing their job all day, every day for 12, 13 hours, barely had time to eat and rest, and then would sleep in a very, very tiny area. It was very poor living conditions. The six risers, which I believe are the industrializing six, I'll show you who they are in the next slide, but that includes, I believe, Poland in Europe, Taiwan, oh sorry, not Taiwan, Indonesia, shoot, I forgot the other ones, but I'll show you in a moment. This share also increased, and the rest of the world stayed relatively stable. Oh yeah, here, sorry. The risers are here. Korea, India, Indonesia, Thailand, Turkey, and Poland. Oh, I forgot about Turkey. Yeah. Yes, you're right. In the 1990s, the fall of the Soviet Union made Eastern European countries a good environment for parts to be produced in, especially for European firms, because of a very short distance. So I know, for instance, that one of the biggest car brands in France, which is called Renault, produces some of its cars in Romania in particular. So they have a couple models which are fully produced in Romania as a partnership with another firm in Romania to enjoy small production costs, low production costs, and also low transportation costs. Romania is only 2 or 3 countries away from France. They could actually produce the car in Romania and drive the car itself to France to be sold. So let's look at the share of manufacturing output in G7 countries between 1970 and 2010. Until 1990, although we could see a decrease in the percentage of manufacturing output for most G7 firms, the decrease became a bit starker after 1990. You can see here it's pretty sharp in France, pretty sharp in the UK and Italy, actually the sharpest. Canada stayed a bit stable and then decreased. Germany decreased as well. Japan increased a bit, but then decreased. Yeah, wasn't there a crisis in Japan in the 90s? I believe there was. Maybe that could play a role. Of course, those trends are different because also those countries might have some different specialties, might produce different types of items that maybe took more time to get produced in an efficient way by other firms in other countries. Looking at now the I6 manufacturing shares, so the percent of the world manufacturing output, well, again, you can see an exponential curve here in China, for China. Especially starting in the 1990s, it became very steep. But the rest, all the 5 other I6 countries are also experiencing a sharp increase in the percentage of manufacturing output. With this new globalization came what is called a commodity supercycle. All those industrializing countries, the I6 in particular, experienced a high growth in income. There was a high demand for labor in those countries by G7 countries. So income rose, which created a new demand for the same goods that they were producing pretty much. And we could observe what we call a commodity supercycle. I'm going to explain in the next slide what that means. Canada, Australia, Russia, and there are a couple of other countries have been beneficiaries of this commodity boom. So, a commodity supercycle is a cycle where we see commodity prices go through extended periods of either boom or bust. Because those periods are extended and pretty sharp, those changes are pretty sharp, we call them super cycles. In general, commodity prices movements are important for Canada because they help determine the country's terms of trade, which is the ratio of export prices to import prices. That can help with the exchange rate, how the Canadian dollar does with respect to the American dollar or the euro, and so on. That can also have an impact on employment through exports and imports, and also income and inflation. There have been 4 broad-based commodity supercycles since the early 1900s. The most recent started in the mid-90s and has been in the downswing phase. So prices have been decreasing. Those cycles are a result of surges in demand and slow-moving supply responses. But those surges can be large, first of all. That's when it's going to create those peaks. And they have to be long. That's what creates the extended periods of booms or busts. Terms of trade is the price of exports divided by the price of imports. So usually to compute terms of trade, we compute a price index of everything that is being exported divided by a price index of everything that's being imported. When we talk about increasing terms of trade or improving terms of trade, we are then talking about this number increasing. So the price of exports increases relative to the price of imports. That could be due, for instance, to an increase in demand for your country's goods, which allows you to sell them for a higher price abroad. So we can look at commodity supercycles and terms of trade by looking at how real prices change over time. Here's a graph with supercycles for 4 different types of goods. We look at their prices over time, and then we make a trend. So think about the trend as being just a line that goes through a bunch of points over time. Okay, that would be the trend. Oh, overall it seems to be increasing, decreasing. We say overall because from one year to another, sometimes you could have a sudden increase or a sudden decrease. You could have shocks. But the trend seems to go upwards, downwards, or flat. Here, we are looking at fluctuations around the respective trends. So, that's why the curves are centered around 0. The trend is, it's not that the trend is 0, it's that, for example, for the yellow curve here, at this trough, this distance represents a percentage deviation from the trend. So if the trend was a certain number in 1909, 1910, in that year, there was a huge trough in the price of oil. So oil became very, very cheap in particular that year. And so there was a huge percentage deviation from the overall trend. Then it becomes positive, which means oil got more expensive than the trend. Then again, cheaper than the trend. Then way more expensive than the trend. And here you can see that this period corresponds to the 2 oil shocks. First one being in 74, second one being in 79, I believe. 74, 75 for the first, and 79, 80 for the second. I believe that those are the oil shocks. Then decreased again in 1995. I don't know if you remember, but I believe I remember in 2006 there was a huge, well, maybe not as big as here, but oil prices was pretty high. In France, it was, I remember, the highest price I remember was €1.60 per liter. €1.60 is like $2.20 per liter, Canadian dollars. So pretty big. Oil is still more expensive in France anyway, gasoline. Now let's go over those 2 graphs. Those graphs report the change in the source of export growth for different countries between 1994, pretty much the beginning of the second unbundling, and 2008, which is 14 years. So let's start with, let's say Japan to the right here. So the way you should understand this graph is around 70%, 75% here of the export growth in Japan between 94 and 2008 is due to manufacturing. So growth, exports increased in all of those countries over time, over the course of those 14 years. This graph is breaking down this growth, this export growth by sector. The primary sector is agriculture, typically. Manufacturing is the second sector. And the tertiary sector is going to be services. We see a huge increase in particular for China. More than 80% of their export growth over those 14 years is coming from manufacturing. Korea, Turkey, Poland. So those are part of the I6. Indonesia as well. Well, the number is a bit more smaller, but Indonesia is also part of the I6, and so on. Here, in the G7 countries, there is still a pretty high increase, a pretty high share of export growth coming from manufacturing. That is probably a very specific type of goods. But you can see that for G7 countries, there is a way higher share of services responsible for the export growth as opposed to I6 countries and developing countries. So for developing countries, I'm not sure we can say that about Korea, but maybe in the 90s we can. The export growth is mostly due to an increase in manufacturing and primary goods. Getting fruits, veggies, and foods in general produced by those countries. In G7 countries, it's mostly due to services. Although not everywhere, you can think about Canada here, which had a lot of primary goods, and Australia as well. I'm not sure what kind of primary goods in Australia, but I'm guessing that lumber goes into the primary sector in Canada, I would assume. Oh, mining in Australia. Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Kevin. You're right. Mining. Always forget about that. I have friends in Australia who work in mines literally, and I always forget about this stuff. So, since we talk about exports, it's important to talk about value added. The value added of an industry, also referred to as gross domestic product, GDP, by industry, is the contribution of an industry to the overall GDP. Value added, that's a very important definition that you might go through in other econ classes, like 105, for instance. This is one of the most important definitions in macroeconomics. It is equal to the difference between an industry's gross outputs, think about sales and other operating income, and the cost of its intermediate inputs. Intermediate inputs refer to raw materials, energy, equipment, semi-finished products, and any services that you need to produce your goods. So let's say you need to hire an accountant, or for an accountant services, you need to, instead of hiring an accountant, you are outsourcing your accounting to another firm. Paying that other firm would be counted as an intermediate input. Buying paper for the office, buying printers, not printers, sorry, that would be an investment. But all of those things such as paper would be part of intermediary inputs. Raw materials, everything you need to produce. The difference between those two things is what we call the value added. The value added can be computed at the firm or at the global value chain level, or more broadly at the industry level. Careful, however. It sounds a bit like value added is the same as profits. No, no, no. At the firm level, the value added is just sales minus intermediate inputs. But you can see that in those intermediate inputs, I do not include labor. And that's why I mentioned if you hire an accountant, literally you have an accountant in your firm working for you, that will count as a wage. If you pay another firm to do the accounting for you, that will be counted as an intermediate input. If you want to obtain profits, you need to take the value added and then remove compensation. Compensation corresponds to paying your employees and paying back your loans. And you have other things. You have one or two other things to deduct. Then finally you obtain profits in the accounting sense. Pure profits, what the company is making. Then on that you can compute the tax on profits, the corporate tax. You obtain your after-tax profits, and with your after-tax profits, you can decide what to do with it. You might decide to reinvest some of this money, save it, maybe increase your employee's wage on the next year, something like that, or maybe redistribute some of this money back to your shareholders in the form of dividends. So value added is not the same thing as profits. Careful. When we compute GDP, we take the value added of every country in a given territory. We add them up, and this is what we call GDP. So, the narrative behind this whole history of globalization was those two different unbundlings that led to first the Great Stagnation, that was before the first unbundling, then the Great Divergence with the first unbundling, and finally a Great Convergence with the second unbundling. So we should see that in the GDP shares change. Locating 1990 here, we can see that the share of global GDP decreased for G7 countries as opposed to being relatively stable since the 60s, and it had been increasing before due to the first unbundling, whereas it increased for the rest of the world and the rising 11, which are China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Nigeria, Korea, Australia, Mexico, Venezuela, Poland, and Turkey. You don't need to remember those guys, okay? Because I won't. So the loss in G7's GDP share was won by just 11 rising economies. So there was a loss of, they went from 70% to, what do we have, 50-ish%, 50%, so around 20%. This share was mainly taken by the R11, the rising 11 economies. Whereas for the rest of the world, it stayed fairly stable. Increased a bit, but stayed fairly stable. Let's talk about China a bit, because China seems to be the country that benefited the most from the second unbundling. And indeed, you can look at the global GDP shares from 1990 to 2012. That increased by 10 points. 10%. So, China's GDP share used to be, do I have the number? I don't have the number here. In 1990, but in 2012 was 10 percentage points higher. It increased a bit in other countries, but definitely China is the one for which this change was the biggest. And indeed, if you look at the share of a global GDP, they went from 2% in 1990 to 9% in 2010 and even a bit higher in 2012. What about the impact on global poverty? So, looking at different countries, looking at different categories of countries, and here by categories I mean the low middle income countries, the high to middle countries, and the low income countries. So they are ranked by GDP. We can see that there was a very sharp decrease in the number of people under $2 a day in high to middle income countries, starting in the 1990s. That led to 650 million fewer poor. However, if you look at low income countries and low to middle income countries, the number of poor people actually increased a bit. So the second unbundling reduced poverty as a whole, but again, there are some winners, there are some losers. Not everybody benefited from this second unbundling. Now let me get into intra-industry trade before I finish the lecture. I probably won't have time to finish everything today, but I will finish after the break. Intra-industry trade refers to exports and imports of products belonging to the same industry. So these products are differentiated. They can be, for instance, a BMW versus a Toyota. The car industry is a perfect example for intra-industry trade. Or it can be intermediate products belonging to the same class of products. Wheels, seats, engines, mirrors, glass, and so on. Here is a formula of the intra-industry trade index. So if M is what we use for imports in a sector I, could be the car sector, and X is the letter we use for exports, this index is defined as 1 minus the absolute value of exports minus imports divided by exports plus imports. You don't need to know this formula by heart, but you need to know what's above, what it refers to, what it represents, and you need to know those characteristics. Okay? What is the point of such an index? The idea of this index is to measure the intensity of intra-industry trade. So within one sector, within one industry, the index should be high if there is both a lot of exports and a lot of imports, but should be small if there are many exports, low imports, or many imports, low exports. Note that if X or M is equal to 0, so if inside an industry there is no import of a part used for that same industry, or there is no export of parts used in that same industry, then the index will be equal to 0. Imagine that, imagine M is equal to 0, whatever X is, you get 0 here, 0 here, Xi divided by Xi is equal to 1, 1 minus 1, 0. On the other hand, if there are as many exports as there are imports in that industry, then xi minus mi is equal to 0. This whole ratio is equal to 0, and the index reaches the highest value, 1. Then, when exports and imports inside an industry are not the same, the index will be between 0 and 1. This concept has been co-created by an SFU prof, Herbert Grubel. So if you, well, I guess now it's a bit complicated, but if you walk around in the department, you can find a picture of Herb Grubel, and probably still alive. He also has an award in his name, maybe actually for undergrads who do very well, or undergrads on the honors program. And he co-created this concept, and it's a way to measure how much intra-industry trade there is in a given sector. Let's look at the average index across sectors. So you look at, for instance, France and Germany, and you compute the intra-industry trade in all of their the sectors, and you look at their imports and the exports from one country to another, and you take the average. Note that this has increased over time, mainly due to European Union benefiting from trade agreements, benefiting from being bordering country, so know-how can flow very easily, benefiting from a common history as well, benefiting from very similar productivity employees, and so on. US and Mexico increased as well, mostly due to NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. The same index is pretty high between Japan and Thailand, or Germany and Poland, and those are due not to free trade agreements, but rather to the second unbundling. Okay, it is already too late. Unfortunately, I have maybe 5 slides to cover. No, IIT, the intra-industry trade, is not always measured between 2 countries. It could be measured at the world level when you look at the car sector. You look at how many car parts, anything related to cars, car parts, are being exported in the world, and you look at how many car parts or cars are being imported in the world. And that would tell you the ITT in the car sector, in the car industry at the world level. The idea is that if you limit this to specific countries, you can look at the imports and exports between 2 countries. And so this allows us to look at the dynamics of trade between trade partners. In particular, here we have 2 high IITs, due to free trade agreements, regional trade agreements, but 2 of them are due to the second unbundling. And there are many more. This is a way to show that Germany and France, in every sector, not just cars, seem to have a very privileged trade relationship, a very strong trade relationship. Same with the US and Mexico. Same with Germany and Poland. So it seems that Germany is doing a lot of stuff with Poland. Also, they are bordering countries. Poland had cheap labor due to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it's a partner of choice for Germany. And Japan seems to do a lot of business with Thailand, and vice versa. Okay, I am a bit late. So, next lecture, I will finish those 5 slides. It's pretty much what I have. Maybe a bit more than 5, okay? which are pretty much related to other types of trade agreements. Rather than just agreeing on tariffs and subsidies and so on, here we're going to talk about bilateral investment treaties, where two countries will agree to invest in each other, whether it's about building plants, having some business relationships, liberalizing investments, promoting investments coming from that country, and so on. We're going to go over that type of agreement between countries and see that due to the second unbundling, it increased a lot over time. Just to give you a spoiler alert, you can see that 97 or 1990 pretty much, sharp increase in the number of bilateral investment treaties. This is due to G7 countries wanting to invest in developing countries to benefit from a cheap labor force. That's it for this lecture. Have a good rest of your week and see you in the next one. Bye.